This is part 10 of my series on Lucy Letby and the miscarriage of justice that put her in prison for crimes she did not commit. And today's video is on the prosecution's case, namely Nicholas Johnson, the lead prosecutorial barrister. And I'm not going to go into the ways in which the adversarial system may not work for certain cases and why the inquisitorial system might be better, because I'm not educated on those things. So I would just be throwing in my opinion when I can't really back it up with any information. So rather than getting into any of that, I'm just going to go through the ways in which I feel Nick Johnson twisted and bended the truth and behaved in bullying and unprofessional ways in order to win his case. And before I start, I know that that's his job. It's his job to win the case. But I would posit that if his job is to win the case against all truth, then perhaps his job needs to be changed. The code of ethics behind UK prosecutors is that if they are handed a case that does not have evidence to prove someone's guilt, then they should turn away the case. And also, another aspect of the prosecutorial code of conduct is that they cannot hide any evidence that might elucidate a defendant's innocence and exonerate them. Nick Johnson allowed a case that has no evidence and refused evidence that would have helped Lucy Letby's cause. So I don't think he did his job properly, even if his job is to win. But let's just go into the many, many ways that Nick Johnson abused his position of power to put Lucy Letby in jail for crimes she didn't commit. So the first thing I want to note is his false humility and the way that he manipulated the jury so that they would get on his side. He used commonly recognized methods to manipulate the jury, and he veered them away from fact toward emotion and fabulation. Fabulation based on the imaginings of a long retired non-neonatal expert witness named Dowie Evans. Nick Johnson had no actual evidence to prove her guilt, and so he had to resort to these tactics, and he did. He used language that discouraged rationality and pointed straight toward finger-pointing, witch hunting, and blame. He used language like calling Lucy Letby calculating. He called her devious. He said that she was a gaslighter. He said she persuaded the consultants on the unit at the Countess of Chester to think that the upticks in death was just a run of bad luck. As if Lucy Letby could convince the consultants of anything. If she could, she wouldn't be where she is right now. And also, they weren't listening to nurses about the causes of these deaths. We've heard time and time again that the nurses were disempowered to even step forward as advocates most of the time. So Lucy Letby had nothing to do with convincing anybody of anything on that unit. But he said so anyway, because it didn't matter to him what was true. It just mattered to him what would get the jury on his side. He used a very long closing statement, just pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages. And I think the reason he did this was to confuse the jury with word salad, to continue to bring them onto his side with emotion and irrationality so that they would not notice that in his entire closing statement, he told fallacies, falsehoods, and had no evidence at all. This is a man who's not afraid to look like a fool as long as he wins. He called himself a bit slow when he was questioning her, and he was pretending not to understand some aspect of the questioning for the sake of the jury, so that the jury would think, hey, he's one of us, he's one of us, when all he's doing is showing what he thinks of the jury at all, when he assumes that being slow would get them on his side. He said, and just paragraph 82, I'd like to ask you a question about that. You say you don't specifically remember hanging the bag, meaning the insulin bag that she was accused of poisoning. but you think Nurse A hung it? And Lucy answers, yes. And he said, it's probably me being a bit slow, wink, wink to the jury. But I don't understand how these two statements go together. You either remember it or you don't. So do you remember? No, Lucy says. Just a way of showing his everyday, every guy kind of state of being when it was as far from the truth as is possible to be. He used a made up relationship with a doctor on the unit at the Countess of Chester to manipulate the jury into believing that Lucy Letby violated the social construct known as promiscuity. He used that over and over again to make them judge her in a different kind of way so that they would get on his side. And I'll show more of that later, but because he used that in other ways as well, but he really used that to manipulate the jury. And he used false humility and phony friendship again. He was talking to the jury about baby C, and he said something like, health warning, a barrister is not a reliable source, okay? As if he thinks that way about himself at all. And hopefully he didn't fool the jury into thinking that's how he thinks of himself. But unfortunately, judging from the outcome of the case, he did. Nick Johnson displayed many examples of bad behavior throughout the case. I'm just going to go through a lot of them. This is actually with regard to after the case. He represented the Chester police at the coroner's inquest into the deaths of the babies. And I think at best that's a conflict of interest. And it's very telling about the whole state of affairs in general, I think. And I'll say no more about that. He disallowed, with the agreement of the judge, the RCPCH reports. And the two of them said that the reason they wouldn't allow that report, which spoke to the condition of the neonatal ward at the Countess of Chester and the reasons why that condition contributed to the death of the babies, he said they didn't use it because that report wasn't conducted with the aim of finding murderous intent, and so it doesn't really count. But in fact, it was actually with that intent. The reason the RCPCH did their report on the Countess of Chester's neonatal unit is because of the concerns the consultants put forward about a nurse doing damage to babies. So they came in and they did a review to see why these upticks in deaths were happening, and they found that it had nothing to do with an individual, but with the conditions of the unit. That wasn't allowed into court. The jury never saw that. So they weren't able to ascertain that other groups believed that Lucy Letby was innocent as well. That's bad behavior, I think. He also didn't allow the fact that Lucy Letby won her grievance against the consultants into the court case. Lucy Letby spoke to hospital management after the RCPCH report was concluded and listed all of the ways in which she was mistreated and asked how that was going to be resolved. And the hospital agreed that those things needed to be resolved. And the consultants were forced to apologize to her for accusing her of things she didn't do and for bullying her. That wasn't shown to the jury. If that's not leaving out important evidence that would exonerate a defendant, I don't know what is. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it's questionable. The judge allowed it, so there you go, but I don't know. There was a terrible sewage problem at the Countess of Chester in the neonatal unit, and this is well known. Sewage was backing up into the sinks and coming through the ceilings, and this caused a superbug and caused sepsis and pseudomonas, which is very dangerous to vulnerable preterm babies and kills them, and in fact did kill them in most cases. This was even claimed by the consultants themselves, the ones who accused Lucy Letby of murder. They themselves said that sepsis was an issue on the unit and probably contributed to the deaths of many of the children. But Nick Johnson in court claimed that the plumbing in the unit had nothing to do with the children's collapses and deaths. That's a complete lie. It's a lie. It's an outright untruth. Why is that allowed? Johnson was perfectly fine with Dowie Evans changing his mind about the cause of death of baby I. That didn't seem to present a problem for him at all. Dowie Evans changing his mind halfway through testimony, totally fine with him. If the cause of death shifts halfway through, and then lets note after the case. Doesn't that change things for the defendant? Apparently not for Nick Johnson. He dangled a very flawed shift chart in front of the jury through the entire case. The shift chart, and all of the evidence, of course, was presented to him by the Chester police, but he used it. He used a shift chart that Professor Jane Hutton, when hired by the Chester police to examine the statistics used for this chart, said that they were incredibly flawed, made no sense, and that the chart was meaningless. And when she said that, her services were no longer wanted. The Chester police suggested in an email to her that the Crown Prosecution Service told them not to use her after she said that the chart wasn't meaningful. The CPS has denied that, but how can we ever know? Regardless, Nick Johnson used this shift chart that was completely flawed, that took Lucy Letby's shifts and made it look like she was present for all of the murders and attempted murders when she actually was not, and when they could have taken any nurse on the floor at any time and created the exact same chart. That didn't matter to Nick Johnson. He just used his chart to dangle in front of the jury so that they saw this long purple line showing that Lucy Letby was present for all of the murders, and that psychologically affected them. It was a visual representation that encouraged a false inference based on flawed data and led to her conviction. He rarely mentioned the postmortems that showed that the infants died from natural causes. And he used the excuse that the postmortems were devised without the intent of looking for murder, and that since this is murder, they don't count. But that's disingenuous at best. The pathologist doing the postmortem is looking at the baby itself and deciding the cause of death. If there was a nefarious intent in the death of the infant, the pathologist would know it and see it. Dowie Evans can't give evidence about this baby because Dowie Evans never saw the babies. The pathologists did, but Nick Johnson didn't seem to think that mattered at all. Dowie Evans' testimony was enough, according to him. The opinion of a long retired, non-neonatal witness mattered more than a working professional pathologist. Interesting. He created many devious devices to assassinate Lucy Letby's character, and he twisted evidence to make it look like she was guilty when Occam's razor shows that her explanations were the most sensible of all. He didn't want to hear any explanation. He just went with the most irrational reason behind each bit of information. The police, of course, set the precedent for this, but he's smarter than the police by far, and he went with it too, with intention. So I hold him responsible for that. A doctor on the unit used a paper towel to write down some information about a child who sadly later passed, and that paper towel wound up in the trash. The police found a similar paper towel at Lucy Letby's house and accused her of keeping the paper towel that the doctor threw out as a trophy for the death of the infant, which they said she caused. The paper towel was not the same paper towel, and it would have required her to dig through the trash after her shift in order to get it. Nick Johnson grasped onto that and accused her of searching for the paper towel in the trash, and she denied it and denied it. But he didn't care. He continued to suggest that this was evidence of murder because she wanted a trophy from the trash, which she said she did not want or try to get. She had notes that she had written on the advice of an occupational therapist at the hospital, where she wrote her feelings. And many of her feelings revolved around a sense of horror and guilt that she might be a bad nurse and that she might be responsible for the deaths of the infants because of her bad practice. Other parts of those same notes cry out with the injustice of being a victim, being slandered, being attacked and harassed when she was innocent and had done nothing wrong. Nick Johnson and the police chose to take the first half of those notes as being the only part of those notes and use them as evidence of a confession. When people who are experts on the subject of confessions look at her notes and say, those are not confession notes, not by a long shot. It doesn't have the detail it needs to be a confession note. It's not a confession note. And also, if you look at them just as a rational, normal human, you can see that they're not confession notes. They're the notes of a traumatized, desperate woman who just lost her job for things she doesn't even understand she's being accused of. And is living in a state of horror and desperation because of it. Nick Johnson didn't care. He didn't care what the truth was. He just used what he needed to use from those notes in order to get the jury to convict her so that he could win his case. At one point, Nick Johnson was questioning Lucy about the police when the police arrested her. And he asked her to tell him what happened. And so she said, at 6 o'clock in the morning, they arrived and got me out of bed and dragged me to the police station in my pajamas. And Nick Johnson stopped there and said, hold on a minute. You weren't wearing your pajamas. You were wearing a tracksuit. To which Lucy Letby said, I was wearing pajamas. I don't know what else to tell you. And he said, no, 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 no. You're lying. Then he turned to the jury and said, she's a liar. See, she's a big fat liar. Look at this liar. She lied about wearing pajamas. When, years later, Netflix releases a documentary using footage that the dumb Chester police gave them, showing Lucy Letby in pajamas as she's being taken to the police station. So the jury used this completely ridiculous information to convict Lucy Letby when she actually wasn't lying at all, because she's not a liar. Lucy Letby took home handover sheets by accident. Handover sheets are the notes that nurses give one another between shifts to update them on what's happening with the patients. And often, as many nurses have said, nurses will shove the handover sheets in their pockets when an emergency arises and then realize when they get home that they have accidentally taken the handover sheets with them. They don't know what to do with them, so they'll either keep them, shred them, or throw them away incorrectly. Lucy chose to keep them. The police and then Nick Johnson decided to accuse her of using the handover sheets as trophies of her victims, which is ridiculous on a number of counts. First of all, only a very small percentage of the handover sheets that she had anything to do with the people she was accused of murdering at all. And then secondly, this has nothing to do with murder. Having pieces of paper in your house does not prove anything at all. It does not prove that it's a trophy of a victim, and it does not prove that you've committed a crime. And yet he used this as evidence, and the jury took it, and the judge allowed it. Another ridiculous aspect of Nick Johnson's case was the shredder. Lucy Letby was accused of lying about having a shredder when she was questioned by the police. The police asked her why she didn't shred the handover sheets, and she said, I don't have a shredder. And they found a shredder later in her house, and they used this as proof that she was dishonest and a liar. And she said, I just didn't remember I had the shredder. And number one, that's totally natural. Even in a normal situation, people forget what they have in their house. They really do. And then in a situation where you've been traumatized and psychologically tortured and physically tortured over and over and over and over again, you might forget you have a shredder. And that happened to Lucy Letby. But Johnson accused her of being a pathological liar, and that's why she said she didn't have a shredder. What he didn't seem to notice, or what he ignored, is that if she had a shredder, why wouldn't she have shredded the handover sheets? Why wouldn't she have shredded the notes? Guess that didn't matter to him. Nick Johnson accused her of stalking the families of her victims on Facebook because it was discovered that some of her Facebook searches were of the families whose babies she cared for, and some of which passed, sadly. Lucy Letby had many Facebook searches. Only a very small percentage of them were the families of the children in the hospital where she worked. And she looked, I posit, at the families because she cared and wanted to make sure they were doing okay. She developed a connection with them while she was working with them and with their child, and she wanted to be sure that they were doing well. And she was curious. And yet he turned this into a nefarious stalking situation where she wanted to feed off the family's pain and was enjoying what she had done. He completely twisted it and ignored the fact that many people do Facebook book searches every day. And if you can use those as evidence of a crime, then we've got a big problem in this world. And secondly, he didn't acknowledge that maybe she just cared. He used foolish evidence that wasn't evidence at all to convince the jury that she was capable of murder. One of the things that Lucy said drove her to write the notes that were suggested to her by the occupational health therapist at the hospital was that she felt isolated from her coworkers and her friends on the unit because she had been told that she couldn't talk to them. And she didn't for the most part. Sometimes she did, but mostly she stayed away because that's what she was told to do, and she didn't want to do anything to damage her case. And Nick Johnson accused her of lying about this. He said that it was a sob story trying to win over the jury and that she wasn't really devastated and that she liked looking for attention and that it wasn't true at all, that she could have contacted these people anytime she wanted, when in fact the hospital admitted in the Thirlwall inquiry that they did stop her from contacting people on the unit. She was told specifically, don't contact anyone on the unit. They later said that maybe that was a misunderstanding between them, that they didn't really mean everyone, but that's how she took it, so she didn't. And it created a sense of isolation and fear for her that led to these notes. But Johnson didn't pay attention to any of that. Why would he? The staff at the Countess of Chester and most hospitals use swipe cards to get in and out of the rooms. And Nick Johnson used the data from those swipes to prove that Lucy Letby was present for the supposed murders and attempted murders. He used it a lot throughout the case. But later it was shown that all of that data was reversed and that entering was actually leaving. So none of this evidence, quote unquote, that he used was valid at all. And yet, of course, when that came out, he said that doesn't affect our case at all. It doesn't matter. She's still a murderer. Doesn't matter. It was just a small part of our case. And interestingly, when he used it in court, he would say that it was incredibly important, the swipe card data, when he had proof that she had used it and was present. But when he didn't have swipe card data, he would say that that doesn't matter at all. That data doesn't matter at all for his case. So he twisted and contradicted himself in using this data. And then in the end, it turned out to be worthless anyway. He accused Lucy Letby of turning off child G's monitor in order to hasten the child's death. When later, in the same court case, John Gibbs was shown to have accidentally left the monitor off, and that he and Harkness, another doctor on the unit, had apologized to Lucy Letby and to another nurse for forgetting to turn the monitor on and for other things that they did that were mistakes that led to danger to this child. But Nick Johnson didn't seem to care about that. All that mattered to him was the lie that Lucy Letby had turned it off. This is just customary of him in this court case. He didn't seem to mind that Ravi Jairam lied on the stand about seeing Lucy Letby standing over a child with a breathing tube that had been dislodged and doing nothing about it, when later emails showed that Ravi Jairam at the time of the event said that she called him for help, actually, to do something about the child. And it was also shown that it probably wasn't her at all. But if it had been her, an aspect that Nick Johnson didn't bother to tell the jury, which they should hear, is that it's typical for nurses, if a preterm infant's breathing tube is dislodged, to watch the infant for a few seconds just to see how it adjusts to not having air, so that they know what kind of condition the child is actually in. It's difficult to remove a breathing tube from a preterm child. They're small, and infection is a very dangerous possibility. So if she had been standing over the infant for a few seconds while the breathing tube had been dislodged, she would have been doing the right thing. But number one, Ravi Jairam lied. She called for help. And number two, it probably wasn't her at all. But this didn't matter to Nick Johnson. As long as he was able to prove his case and win, doesn't matter if it's the truth. His bullying of Lucy Letby on the stand was astounding. And his immaturity was shocking as well. At one point, he was questioning her, and she said she couldn't remember a date or an incident. And he said to her, "Do you remember being born?" And she said, "No." As if that has any place in a professional court case like this, as if making fun of her and making her feel twisted and tied up and pinned down is his job. It's not. His job is to present the evidence to the jury. That's it. He accused her, as I mentioned before, of being in love with a registrar who was working at the Countess of Chester on the unit. And that's the reason she hurt the babies, to get his attention. And he said that she liked a crisis situation, that it made her look like she was really good at her job, and she wanted this doctor to see that about her, which of course she denied because it's ridiculous. But he kept driving home that point, that she was in love with this registrar and that's why she was hurting babies. Yet another foolish path he went down to prove that she was guilty, one of many which made no sense. They were friends. She acknowledged that they were friends, but there's nothing in the text that suggests anything but friendship. And he suggested that an emoji that she used when she responded to one of his texts meant that it was romantic. If that's the case, then every single friend I have is a romantic interest of mine. Nick Johnson, maybe he is of a generation that doesn't understand that, but he should probably do his research before he leads a case like this if he doesn't know that kind of information. But that didn't matter to him anyway. Along those same lines, and incredibly egregious, in my opinion, was he pinned her down with a text where this doctor said something about her going commando because she was working and forgot a change of clothes, and he was teasing her about not having underwear. Maybe that means he had a crush on her. That's possible. But over and over again, Lucy Letby said she did not have any feelings for this doctor, that they were just friends. And Nick Johnson embarrassed her by continuing to question her about not having underwear on, about going commando, and making fun of her for not knowing what going commando means, which is completely unprofessional and should not have been allowed in a court case, and was like the behavior of a 10-year-old. He tried to make her seem like she was simple and disingenuous, and really was aggressive with her. And he took fanciful leaps to prove her guilt that had no evidence whatsoever, as usual. Here's an example of him doing that, of taking yes, no answers and building a story around them, regardless of any evidence and regardless of the truth. I'm just going to read this for you. Just to bring it back to mind, this particular shift, this is the shift where your colleague, Nurse B, suggested she had to keep, in effect, removing you from the parents' room as baby C was dying and just after he died. Do you remember that evidence? Lucy says, yes. I'm going to suggest that your assertion in your defense statement that your recollection of events prior to baby C's collapse being vague is not true. What do you say? She said, I don't agree with that. He said, you don't. And I'm going to suggest that you enjoyed what happened, and that's why you were in and out of the family room. She said, no. How does he know anything at all about that moment? He was not present. He has no evidence to show that this is the case. And no one has accused her of doing this. Even this nurse who said that they kept having to remove her from the room. Even they couldn't say that it seemed like she was enjoying it. This is just him building stories around nothing for the jury, and it worked. There was a moment when she was on duty and she texted one of her colleagues that the unit was too quiet. And he accused her of being bored, that she liked it when babies were dying. It was exciting, that she wanted more death, basically, is what he said. And she told him that it just was that she enjoyed being busy and that it was slow. But I have to be honest, I think maybe she's not remembering, because the minute I see that text, the way I read it is, it's the calm before the storm. You know how when you are nervous that something is going to happen and it's very quiet and you're like, yeah, it's quiet now, but it's a little too quiet. That's what I posit she was probably saying, but it was years ago. She doesn't remember. She's been through a lot, or maybe I'm wrong and it really is that she just likes to be busy. But either way, it's not that she liked deaths, and there's nothing saying that that's the case, and there's no evidence to prove it. So why is he bringing it up? because the Chester police told him to. He forced Lucy Letby to agree to things that she couldn't possibly deny. And then he would use that as proof that she was guilty. The police did this too. But again, he's smarter than the police, so he should know better. An example of this, Dr. Brunton was talking about skin discoloration on the babies and air embolism. And Johnson forced Lucy to acknowledge that Dr. Brunton was saying this about the discoloration, which of course she did. But that doesn't mean that she perpetrated murder upon these babies through air embolus. It's just not, there's no evidence there. But he used that as a jump to say that she was agreeing that there was discoloration and modeling because of air embolism. The insulin, which Lucy Letby was accused of using to poison some of the infants' feeding bags. This has been shown to be a ridiculous fantasy. It's not possible to poison feeding bags with insulin because the insulin sticks to the sides. That's one thing. There was no forensic evidence. The tests required to show that there was insulin in the bags were not done. And the tests required on the infants to show why they had such high levels of insulin were not complete. And most importantly, no one saw her do anything. But Lucy was forced to agree that the insulin poisoning happened because that's what the evidence said. What was she supposed to do? If professionals and experts are saying this feed bag was poisoned with insulin, she's not going to say, no, I deny that. That's not true. She doesn't know. She was telling the truth. But then she did say, I didn't do it, though. It may be that the feed bags were poisoned, but I did not poison them, which that part wasn't heard. Only that she accepted that they had been poisoned was heard. And then it was twisted to mean that Lucy Letby was present. She's the only one who could have done it, and so she did do it. In one case, also, hypoglycemia reportedly continued after the infusion bag was changed. And the prosecution argued that more than one bag must have contained insulin, and that's why it continued, that the new bag that replaced the old bag had insulin too. But that would mean that Lucy Letby would be required to have the powers of Nostradamus to know which bag was going to be chosen and placed on which infant that had already had poisoning placed in the bag to continue the job. It's just impossible. It's ridiculous. It's like Hans Christian Andersen. It's a fairy tale that this man is creating around insulin. And yet it worked. It was considered the smoking gun of the case. This was his best evidence, no evidence at all. Experts since have proven that this is just absolutely ridiculous, that infants often have high insulin levels when they have sepsis, which these infants had, and infection, which these infants had. And yet that wasn't mentioned in court. And actually, at one point, Lucy did dispute the insulin. Just to be fair, she did say, I don't think insulin was a part of this or in the bags. But eventually she was forced to accept it. And that was used as proof that she did it. Nick Johnson displayed monstrous behavior, as did everybody involved in the accusations against Lucy. He was biased, he was unprofessional, he was bullying, he lacked honor, and he lacked humility. And I just want to show the ways, just a few of the many ways that Lucy displayed incredible honor and humility and was exemplary of a good human being throughout the worst situation of her lifetime and the worst situation that I think most people can ever imagine happening to them. Here are some examples. She was being questioned about baby C's death, and she was asked if medical incompetence or mistakes were the cause, which they were, but she didn't say that. Even on the witness stand, even when she was being accused of murdering this child, she did not say that the doctors did anything wrong. She still protected the doctors. Even then, she did not want to talk against the health professionals. She was unwilling to speak against Carolyn Oakley's evidence. She said she didn't agree with it, but if that was Carolyn Oakley's evidence, if that was Carolyn Oakley's memory of the situation, then that must be the memory of the situation. She just didn't agree with the memory. Very kind and humble. even in a terrifying circumstance. When she was questioned about child E, she said that child E's death was not necessarily incompetence, but that it was a matter of not acting soon enough, which is a kind way to say that it's incompetence, but she didn't want to say it. She wanted to be kind and compassionate, even in the most horrifying, dangerous of circumstances. This woman was able to overcome her fear and be kind and compassionate. What a lesson to us all. And of course, last but not least, not of all the examples of Lucy's honor and kindness, but of my examples here, Johnson used her honor against her to mean something nefarious. Lucy Letby found herself in the position that she is in now and that she was in then because she was a whistleblower. She was one of the only people who devotedly noted datacs with any of the things that happened on the unit so that they could be fixed. She noted things that the doctors did, she noted things that other nurses did, and she noted things that she did that may have caused problems on the unit so that management could ideally fix it. The consultants on the unit didn't like that. And they used that anger at her to twist their own intentions and begin to believe that she was a murderer when she was not. So Nick Johnson takes this evidence that Lucy Letby would note things in datacs and suggests that she would call out the mistakes of her unit because she thought she was better than everybody else. Number one, she didn't think she was better than everybody else. She included herself in those reports. And number two, it was an honorable thing to do. She was an advocate for these babies and their families. And Nick Johnson turns even that into evidence that she was a murderer. Hopefully, if Lucy Letby is forced to sit through another trial and not exonerated, as I feel she should be, Nick Johnson's responsibility in this whole debacle will be accentuated. Most importantly, though, Lucy Letby just needs to be freed. Responsibility, punishment, being held to account, none of that matters right now. Lucy Letby is innocent. She was forced to sit through a kangaroo court that put her in prison for the rest of her life. Free Lucy Letby. It's the only thing that's right.